It's exciting times. Now, Chuck, I just wanted to start a new chapter off with you. We finished
Mhm.
up our last chapter, which was one of my favorites, and now we're in a new chapter, and you can throw rotten eggs at me because I'm going to say to you what I say almost every chapter, which is this was perhaps my favorite chapter. And of course, I'm talking about chapter 50 from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy. And this is an essay, Philosophy and Theology, by professors Martin J.F.M. Honen and Robert Wisnowski. And I think the topic is probably what is so exciting to me because I've had strong opinions on these things.
This is Generous Theology. In this episode, Chuck and Brock contemplate Chapter 50, Philosophy and Theology, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy.
And opinions are not everything, but opinions do drive things. It's very hard to get deep into discussions on things that you don't have anything more than a passing interest in. And when it came to philosophy and theology, even before studying, I found as a very young man that I had a real bias or a real sort of specific way that I wanted history to unfold. Perhaps that intuition has turned out. I think we can make an argument. And I think that's part of what we can discuss about here is some of that history. But before we back into things and talk about the origins in this chapter, let me just throw it over to you. Philosophy, theology, the interplay between the two, how it came about and maybe developed in the world. What's your interest level with that, and how do you relate it to things from your point of view?
It's interesting because I may have mentioned this a little bit before, but when I took philosophy in college, and my wife also took philosophy in college, and at Dordt College, where we both were students, everyone at the time, in order to, as part of the common curriculum, everyone had to take Philosophy 201, and everybody also had to take a theology class. And the theology class, the Theology 101 class that everybody had to take, was the same, generally the same material, regardless of who taught it. My wife and I both had the same professor, but at different times, Professor Wayne Kobus. And the theology that he did was Old Testament theology. So a lot of it was, we spent time on creation, and then we spent time on redemption and how you see what the Old Testament pointing to Christ and those kinds of things. And so there was some similarity. But we took philosophy from two different professors. I had Dr. John Van Dyke and she had Dr. John Koch. And both of them taught sections of philosophy because everybody had to take it at some point. And we had very different classes, very different coursework. Hers was much more a history of philosophy, focused on, she learned about the Greek philosophers and about medieval and Renaissance philosophy and modern philosophy, and just a survey. And in fact, that survey that she took, she kept the notes and kept the paperback binding. Back in the day, before anyone got too uptight about copyright, professors would take a whole bunch of materials and spiral bind them, and she kept that. And eventually that whole material turned into a book that Dr. Koch published through Dordt College Press, or I guess now it would be Dordt University Press, on the Christian history of philosophy, but focused very much on that history of philosophy, and therefore on some of the themes that we talk about when we've been talking about the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy, when in the past we talked about 19th century philosophy, very much there. My philosophy class with Dr. John Van Dyke was very much a course on Reformational philosophy and Herman Dooyeweerd and modal aspects, and so much more about a system, a particular Christian system of philosophy, and very little about the history. And as a result, there was much more tie to theology. And I often remember thinking that I had a much more theological philosophy course than my wife did, even though we took it around the same time, but just from two different professors. And that was interesting. It was what it was. I didn't think too deeply about it. But then when you and I first got together and started reading together, it was when we were reading Reformed Ethics by Herman Bavinck. And at the beginning of Reformed Ethics, there is a discussion about whether theology is a science, and that entire discussion. And I remember you being very excited about the discussion, and I know that's how I knew you had a real interest in that topic. And it was really interesting to hear Bavinck's ideas about theology as science. There was a sense at one time when theology was considered the queen of the sciences. We note here that Professor Hoonen talks about how there was very much more a connection between philosophy and theology in the Middle Ages that sort of goes by the boards. And in fact, he talks a little bit about how it's really important to, when studying certain thinkers, you have to think about things in the context that they were thinking. And so he warns against this strict divide between theology and philosophy that exists today, because it just wasn't there necessarily in medieval times. And so it's just been interesting to think about now as I read this chapter and think about, where do philosophy and theology have some differences? Where are there some similarities? But then also to relate that a little bit to even potentially a somewhat different. I don't know that Professors Koch and Van Dyke would have disagreed on what is philosophy and what is the relationship to philosophy, between philosophy and theology. But the way they taught their courses in philosophy played out very differently, and I found that to be very interesting, and especially in the light of this sort of discussion. Obviously, in the end, wherever it comes down, and there are some differences, I think that modern divide between philosophy and theology, there are some problems with where that leads, most certainly. But I think we can also accept that there can be some definitional differences between them in terms of how we study them, and that there's some benefit from having those definitional differences. But then we also, as Christians, would always say that there's that famous quote, all of life is religion. So, in a way, our theology, our worldview, to bring it even more broadly, always has an impact on whatever we study, whether it is philosophy or whether it's something else, biology, law, whatever. And as Christians, we can't ever sever that connection between theology and our worldview and whatever else it is that we may be studying, philosophy. And yeah, so that's where I think about it. And this chapter was interesting in that regard. And getting someone who perhaps doesn't, I don't know anything about Professor Martin Hoonen, but perhaps doesn't come from the same, certainly doesn't come from the same exact background as I do, but certainly is thinking about some of these concepts in ways that also I've often thought about. So it was interesting to get into that.
Boy, thank you for that overview, Chuck. I really appreciated that. I think you specified the main categories really well. And of course, with the help of the professors writing the chapter, they bring out these ideas. You and I are talking today in an atmosphere, in an environment where these terms have a certain post Enlightenment modern meaning. And Chuck, as we move into something that's perhaps even postmodern, we're finding that we're right in the middle of a dictionary change. Our lectionaries, our dictionaries, our idioms, our ways of referring to things are perhaps changing even now during our lifetime. And I think that's pretty amazing. So, because of that, I'm hesitant to want to tell a single narrative. And yet, I think we have to still communicate what's happening there. And so, the professors talk about what you were talking about, which was in antiquity. So we're setting the stage before medieval times. Antiquity, philosophy, and theology were largely not separate from each other. We can see that in other subjects through time. So, for example, you can go to times where a mathematics curriculum could include such disparate things as geometry, basic math, group theory, trigonometry, calculus, all of these subjects which are separated today were at one time very much considered one thing. Same thing, for example, with astronomy. Astronomy really developed out of the science of astrology. Or perhaps it's better to say that they both, in antiquity, were so tightly intertwined and eventually they did separate. And so that's the idea here, is that in antiquity, we probably largely had, as a generalization, a lack of separation, or at least not to the degree that we have now. And so that's really important to start with. Now, breaking things out into the large categories and then starting to identify how they move and develop through history is really fun. So when you think about this transition from antiquity to the early Middle Ages, one of the big movements that the professor Hernan highlights here was that Christianity was largely a quote-unquote progressive, in the sense that people might use the term today, a progressive development. And as Christianity spread intellectually throughout the culture, the Mediterranean, the Middle East portions, as well as up into the north and west, into Europe, into what would eventually become the Latin cultures, also down into Africa, the northern part of Africa. This spread happened, and it was really the newfangled thing. Now, I think you and I as Christians would say there's probably more here than just being the new thing, but we have to at least acknowledge that it was the new thing. And Professor Hernan writes that according to these transitional figures, Origen, Augustine, Christianity was something, a form of wisdom superior, the professor writes, to what came before. And so think here of schools of thought like the Platonists, the Stoics, Epicureans, others. And the key item here was this emphasis on divine revelation. So the Christian church had these New Testament scriptures, and they're game-changing, as you can imagine a revelation from God might be. And so that's changing the character from antiquity into the Middle Ages. Now, the Middle Ages are long enough that it's not just as simple as that, but by and large, the Middle Ages are the age of faith, the age of the ascendancy of Christianity as a popular movement, as a whole, as a guiding, as a complete nucleus of culture, maybe we want to put it that way. And so that's something that is really driving. And it's not just one complete victory. Christianity didn't just walk into the room and all the other worldviews just walked out of the room. There was interplay at different times in different places throughout the centuries. Christianity moved forward, then it receded, then it moved forward. But by and large, it was the rising tide. And so that's a pretty exciting time. That's one of my favorite periods to read about as a Christian. But there's a lot going on there. When you think about that transition, and when you think about the interplay of Christianity with the other worldviews, what are some of the other major themes that you think about?